All right, guys, well, thank you for joining. Feel free, if you have any questions, to either raise your hand or submit the questions through the webinar chat. We'll all be watching and keeping an eye on both our attendees' raised hands and any questions that might come through the chat. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how the work from home movements impacted security and where to kind of focus your efforts. We've been getting a lot of questions from our clients on how we should do this, how we should implement various risk management strategies, and really what additional risks having a larger work from home population will add to the organization, as well as what are some specific risks associated with COVID-19. And so we have a couple questions that we've found to be most prevalent. We're gonna kind of tackle those right off the bat. And then we're going to move on to any of your questions that you guys might have. We've got the hour booked, and so let loose with whatever you got. All right, next slide, please. All right, so to start us off, we have a customer who can't join sending in a question. I'm in procurement. I've heard rumors of COVID-19 happening, affecting security. What should I be watching out for?
So with regard to procurement specifically, I would watch out for phony purchase orders. Fraudsters like to take advantage of crises when they take place. There's a lot of an uptick in phishing campaigns and phishing, voice phishing, phone calls, vishing, as it's referred to. And so I would in procurement from that standpoint, I would watch out for those sort of attack attempts. Would be phony purchase orders, people trying to initiate wire transfers or payments on phony POs.
Yeah, to add a little bit to what JD just described, from our experience, what we are seeing in real life, if you guys have a system that is similar to Mimecast or other product that provides additional email protection from attacks, those systems frequently have feature called impersonation protect, which is not typically enabled by organizations. This helps, for example, to prevent emails coming in that would have a sender email address looking quite similar to your internal organization's email address, and help with blocking those emails and preventing, for example, as JD mentioned, fraudulent money transfer requests and so on, as if they're coming from your organization's management or leadership.
Yeah, and to add on to that, or to summarize it, really that is the biggest threat currently that COVID-19 as a phenomena presents to organizations. It's that ability to prey on people's fears in order to get them to download links, to download files, or to give up their credentials. I've heard from several sources that as they've been running customized phishing campaigns internally, that their click rate when they use a COVID-19 pretext versus a, hey, our accountant has sent this to you, please open this up now, they're seeing an increase of 150% click rate in some cases. So definitely something to keep a watch out for.
One other thing to mention, based on the fact that this person is in procurement, if your organization is just moving to work from home mode and don't have enough laptops or machines to support your employees who will be or are working from home, you may want to hurry up to order those, because I was checking, for example, Costco's website, so a significant number of inexpensive machines are sold out. So there may be some shortages when you will try to procure those laptops. So if you have plans, if you are working on those plans, it's better to procure equipment as fast as possible.
So
has been seen. Oh, sorry, go ahead, JD.
To address the first two questions that you proposed in the introduction, how has the work from home movement impacted security? There's actually a few implications outside of just fraud and phishing and those sort of attempts. We are, if your enterprise hasn't already instituted two-factor authentication with people working from home, whether it's on your VPN or through your O365 infrastructure or anything along those lines that they're going to be leaning on extra hard, and without the addition of your other security controls in place within your corporate environment. So I would definitely make sure you focus on enabling two-factor authentication, basically anywhere that it's possible. There's an issue with people's infrastructure who was not designed to allow for work from home, who are scrambling to make that happen, and aggregation of logs. People who are working from home now are routing all of their traffic out of their home internet connection and potentially not sending those logs for internet communication or anything along those lines back to an aggregated logging solution, whether that's a SIM or just a standard log aggregator or a Splunk instance, whatever. You're losing that data. So an extra hard focus needs to be put in place on things that you can control in a work from home situation. And that would be, two-factor authentication, making sure your endpoints are all, any endpoint agents you have are all up to date and installed on any workstation that's going to be moving to a remote scenario. And that's communicating back to your, whether that's a management console or a cloud solution. I would say that those are some big impacts. And then to address what should be the focus of my IT security team right now, that's sort of answered that in the first one. And I would add to that with saying, look at moving to a network architecture that allows for remote workers to route their traffic through your internet connection, through your enterprise security controls, so everything's crossing your firewall and not going out through their residential internet connection. That's basically the couple things I had to add with those two questions.
Yeah, to add on to that, when I was at Discover, one of the things that we did was on all company assets, we had, at the time we had Cisco AnyConnect. And I don't know what they're using now, but it enforced an always on VPN. So you couldn't even access the internet without the VPN being on. Now, is that feasible in a situation like this if you're not already set up for it? No, but it's definitely something to consider as you move forward with either a larger remote workforce or, if it's something that you currently have, it's something that you could look at enabling now in a small setting, and then obviously roll it out to a larger environment. And I'm sorry, Andre, I interrupted you.
No worries. So another thing, as long as we are talking about cloud services, right? Even if you have deployed or in the middle of deploying two-factor, multi-factor authentication for your cloud services, one of the things that is frequently forgotten after migration to the cloud is the fact that you need to implement policy that tighten down security for your cloud deployment. And one of the most critical things that you can do is to make sure that your employees or any contractors that you're using whether it's Google Suite, G Suite, or whether it's Office 365, that you have enabled or actually disabled any ability to forward email content. Because what frequently happens, even if you have dual factor authentication implemented, if somebody was able to penetrate those accounts and gain credentials when this was not implemented or was in the process of being implemented, one of the first things that they will try to do is to forward content of the mailbox. So whenever you receive email, it also ends up in their mailbox, which maybe and most likely will be outside of US. So this allows them to know what you are reading, to see all your emails, and actually to engineer those phishing campaigns, which look much more feasible and result in greater negative consequences just because it looks like a real life email when they craft and send it to you. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Even if you have implemented dual factor authentication, take an extra step, check your cloud email setup, make sure that email forwarding is not enabled, and make sure that it is blocked. This capability should be blocked for users. And another thing to keep
Very good suggestion.
another thing to keep in mind is that systems like Office 365, and it depends on your subscription. So if you have E3 or other type of subscription, have advanced protection capabilities, analytics capabilities. So for example, one example that we like to give, and which actually really helps in situations where somebody is trying to connect to your systems from outside of US, is impossible travel. So just to give you as an example, if I'm logging into my mailbox or into my Azure account from Chicago, and somebody tries to log in with my credentials, let's say from Rome, in 15 minutes, in an hour, this is highly unlikely event. So based on analytics like this, Microsoft should be able to flag and prohibit something like this happening, just because of the fact that events like this cannot exist in the real world. If I'm in Chicago, it's impossible for me to log in from Rome unless I have shared my accounts with somebody else, which we don't recommend. And that's another thing that you should be watching out for, shared accounts.
That's another great suggestion. We used to call that the Superman rule, because you'd have to be Superman to travel from Chicago to Rome in 15 minutes. Also, outside of the cloud-based platforms having detection mechanisms for that rule, if you're doing any sort of log aggregation or have a SIM in place, SIMs will allow for rule logic to be built to detect that sort of activity as well, and that will queue off of things outside of just those cloud platforms. So your VPN client, if it logs in and with a geolocation of an IP in one city versus another city, and if the miles and time elapsed between is not logical, then you can trigger a rule from that as well, from a SIM.
We have a question from an attendee, and it's, even in a VPN scenario, as described previously, I'm paraphrasing there for a second for clarity, users with their personal devices may be using them for VDI, for example, Citrix for corporate networks. Do you see an attack vector there, for example, key logging to capture credentials or exfil data? It depends. So the profile of an attacker who's going to attack an individual is going to be different than the profile of an attacker who is going to target a corporation, in most cases, or in many cases, I should say. A key logger, a attacker would have to specifically target the personal devices of an individual in order to capture those credentials or exfiltrate the data. So I would say the risk for that is pretty low on the likelihood scale, if only because it drastically increases the complexity of the attack chain required to execute that particular type of attack.
And just to add to what Mark just said, with regard to VDI and Citrix infrastructure, again, having two-factor authentication enabled when logging into your VDI infrastructure is going to circumvent any sort of key logging or anything like that, or whether the remote host or the personal device had been compromised, and enabling certain permissions with regard to the VDI infrastructure, maybe just temporarily, disabling things like file copy across the VDI and the desktop that's running the VDI, or not allowing copy and paste, and making sure that even with your persistent VMs in your VDI infrastructure, that maybe after a session of use, you force a reboot on those, because those VMs in a VDI infrastructure are completely rebuilding and flushing any sort of mechanisms that an attacker would try to hook into with regard to aspects of the remote operating system or virtual operating system. That's going to be squashed when that VM is rebuilt after a reboot. That's going to make it very difficult to do any sort of exfiltration of data.
And one more item to keep in mind is the fact that you should disable ability to map the drive, as JD mentioned, from the host to the guest, right? So that there is no file transfer is extremely important. One more thing to keep in mind is that some organizations neglect deploying antivirus, anti-malware solution in the virtual desktop environment. This should not be the case. So if you have ability to deploy and monitor anti-malware or antivirus on your virtual desktops, that everything helps. So that should not be considered a step that should be overlooked.
All right. And if you have any follow-up questions, of course, feel free to ask them. The next question that we have is, do you have any anecdotal information from clients, anonymous of course, that give you insights into where specifically the threat actors are focused on the remote work scenario? For me, as a former red teamer, a lot of times what we would focus on, and this just goes back to what JD would say, multi-factor authentication. Targeting login portals that don't have multi-factor authentication enabled, whether that is OWA, whether that is Citrix, whether that's a web application that you guys host. Those will allow an attacker to not only map users in your environment, but they will potentially allow them to pivot internally and chain different attacks together to breach that perimeter. JD, I know you've got.
Yeah, the other sort of anecdotal experience that I've already seen transpire in the last 2 weeks with regard to some customers of ours would be a focus on that phishing. People making phone calls, people sending emails, with links that are preying on the emotional, anxiety that's happening across the world right now. Just like around holiday time, we have the phishing attacks that focus on using words like shipping confirmation. Around tax time, we have phishing emails that are focusing around the status of tax information or your W-2, etc. Right now, we're seeing phishing emails that are focusing on and preying on people's tendency to listen to their anxious brain over their logical brain and recognize that, why would I be getting an email in my work box that talks to COVID-19 that's coming from IT specifically. Typically your IT department's going to email you something that's it may be because of COVID-19 that they're giving you instructions on something that needs to be implemented in your new work from home environment, or regarding equipment that you have that you'll be using when you work from home, but it's not going to be labeled all over the place COVID-19 in all caps with stars and asterisks and things of that sort. So the phishing increases right now with regard to that sort of, prey on people's emotional reaction is increased. So extra vigilance with regard to, making sure we're not clicking links and we're checking where emails are actually coming from is a huge way to prevent and mitigate those risks.
Another thing to keep in mind, just expanding what we are discussing here, is that extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And for example, in the healthcare industry, there is a significant push and switch happening right now to telemedicine. So with that said, because of attempts to limit contact and to limit contact between nurses, between doctors and patients, telemedicine push is happening right now. So if you guys are in an industry like that is undergoing this, I would say, fundamental change in how you deal with your clients, with the people you take care of, make sure to remember that what they say is that there is nothing more permanent than a temporary solution. So if you are rushing to implement something in place, give it a thought. Like additional hour will not destroy anything or will prevent anything from happening. Just think it through. If you're implementing something, again, to address the needs that are urgent, will it create something in the future that will expose your organization, both from security or from the privacy point of view? And will it be difficult to replace once it's became a part of your standard operational procedures? So even times like this, you have to think strategically, because this will pass, but we don't want to be operating the systems that were not designed from the start to be at least minimally secure.
Yep, I fully agree with that sentiment from Andre. Just there's a sense of urgency in getting some of these systems stood up, but that doesn't mean that we put our due diligence and our ability to design and implement these solutions without security in mind. We don't let that go by the wayside just because of the sense of urgency.
Absolutely. All right, the next question we have is, what are the thoughts on mitigating PII data being saved to home computers as users are using personal computers to work from home? That's a great question. Like we said a little earlier, if you guys are using VDI environments, limiting copy and paste, preventing file and drive mapping, preventing people from downloading files is really important, and relying on the security of that VDI environment. If people are just VPNing in directly, limiting what they can access, so writing rules on the VPN device and then at the router and firewall level to prevent them from accessing and mapping drives, so across 445, things like that. If that's required, limiting that only to the file servers necessary. But at that point, at least in my experience, it becomes very difficult to do things like that without additional controls in place to manage that PII data, such as document management and other applications.
And as the trend has moved away from, SMB shares and port 445 sort of drive mappings to servers, from servers to local hosts. Over the last 5, 10, 15 years, we've moved more towards central storage file share locations that exist within your infrastructure. So focus on people leveraging and using those for files that they're accessing or files that they need to manipulate. If you're an O365 shop, focus on using OneDrive so they're not having to save copies of their files locally, using OneDrive so they can manipulate the file in the cloud and they don't actually have to have a copy on their personal device. And in general, those rules that we've already mentioned previously with things like a VDI infrastructure is a great way to allow people to work from home with a personal device. And, as long as you lock down your permissions in your VDI infrastructure with not allowing file copy, file transfer, mapping a home drive, or copy and paste, there's no possibility for data to be moved from device to device without literally looking at what's on the screen, one screen in your VM, and then typing it out on your your local machine. And that is if someone's that determined to record PII on their local machine, we're talking about an insider threat and a separate outside of normal work sort of scenario where their actions are no longer just trying to do their job. They're actually trying to take information. So those are the things that I think are great to mitigate the PII or just the bleeding of corporate, even if it's not PII per se, just things that don't belong on a personal laptop.
From the VDI setup point of view, so some organizations already have VDI, right? And typically you would be dealing with Citrix or VMware Horizon. But let's not forget that, for example, if you don't have VDI deployed, there are ways to deploy VDI in AWS or in Azure. So you can stand up virtual machines there with paying for the licensing and everything. But again, in some scenarios, it may be easier to modify your infrastructure, because if you're staging VDI in your own environment, you need to place, for example, your server where people would connect to in DMZ, not to expose it completely to the outside, not to open connection to inside of your network. So if you don't have VDI, but you think that it can help, I would suggest exploring capabilities of standing up VDI in the cloud environment instead of rushing it in your on-prem environment.
I'm going to skip ahead one question because I think it follows up really well. For a medium-sized business, there may not be time to get set up or to set up a remote working environment. Should we set up an AWS, Azure, or GCP as a workaround? How can we do that securely? Is vendor guidance enough? That's a tough question. If you're talking about VPNs, you can stand up virtual machines and use something like OpenVPN with key-based authentication as a quick and dirty workaround. As far as standing something up in AWS or Azure, I'm not 100% certain, and JD or Andre may have.
Yeah, it would really
there.
depend on the application, whether or not, you know, if we're talking about a web application or something along those lines, there's going to be a decent amount of development work to just get something stood up in Azure or in AWS that is going to allow people to access it and then, you know, harden that system from the AWS perspective and from the application perspective. If we're just talking about a file share, you know, that's a different story. Yeah, you can set something up in AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, you know, pretty quickly that you can transfer files between and share files or set up an FTP, a secure FTP server or something along those lines. If you have to have a way to share files with other individuals and you don't have access to, you know, a Microsoft OneDrive or any other mechanism that's going to facilitate that because you were totally unprepared for, you know, moving to this sort of work from home scenario. So you can set something up quick and dirty in AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, depending upon, you know, what your application is going to be or what your use case is going to determine how complex and how difficult that is. You know, there's going to be data limits for your AWS or Azure or Google Cloud infrastructure in terms of transfer that you're going to have no idea what your baseline is going to be. So once you stand those devices up in the cloud, you know, if you start heavily leaning on them and you didn't provision for the appropriate amount of data transfer or data usage within that environment, it's going to get, you know, AWS, Jeff doesn't care. He'll turn it off until you either upgrade your tier or you know, you wait until your next billing cycle restarts. And that's the hard truth of how AWS works. So I'd say, is it possible? Yes. Is it realistic? Really depends upon your use case.
And one thing to keep in mind is that typically when you go through, for example, AWS setup, right, you would have a VPN set up between your on-prem systems and AWS. And so that allows, if you have anything running in AWS, for example, if you stand up your virtual desktop environment in AWS, it will be able to connect to your systems on-prem through this VPN channel. So when you are thinking about using AWS, you have to think again about how to connect this AWS environment to your on-prem environment, if you have such, if you're not doing it, a wholesale migration, 100% migration. And one thing that I can tell you based on my experience is that AWS faults are really helpful when you are setting up VPN. For example, if you have some sort of the firewall that is already deployed and that firewall supports VPN connectivity, AWS should be able to help you use that equipment to establish a VPN tunnel. So don't underestimate the technical help, but again, think through if you will be providing services both from on-prem systems and from the cloud systems, you need to enable those systems to talk to each other.
All right, great. Thanks, guys. Our next question is, for many organizations, staff were sent home without any time to provision laptops. How can they do that on the fly?
I mean, that's another great question. You know, especially with supply chain demands and breakdowns from where we're provisioning laptops from, things coming from China being delayed, being held up in customs. It's not easy. If your IT department or your organization doesn't have those laptops on standby, and they're not going to let you just pick up your tower or your desktop from your office and drive it home, you know, you're either going to have no choice but to rely on your personal device if you have one. If you don't, then you're going to have to obtain, you know, something that will allow you to do your job. You know, if you can do your job from a tablet, great. You know, solely focusing on web applications or, Other things that we've already mentioned. If you have to go to Best Buy and buy a laptop or order one online, just make sure. My recommendation is if you're backed up against the wall and that's your only option is to go out and buy something new, would be hopefully your organization will reimburse you for that, and it would become their property. And then make sure that you work with your IT department to get any kind of security controls, installed on that device, from AV, EDR tools, VPN agents, all that kind of stuff.
One of the more difficult solution maybe, but totally feasible, right, is for your IT folks to create virtual machines. And if you cannot stand up or you're not using a virtual desktop environment that is based on your data center or cloud, there is also a possibility to package those VMs and distribute them to user machines so that they will be running a separate VM on their home machine specifically for the office use. So this is not the easiest thing to do, but again, this kind of relieves the need to have a device provision, and at the same time will give you IT folks control of that VM that will be running on top of the home machine.
Great, thanks guys. All right, and if you have a follow-up question, feel free to, of course, jump in with that. We have a question from a client who could not be here through his sales executive. With people taking their laptops home without drive encryption, how concerned should this individual or this company be with drive theft?
Well, I would say if the individual is staying home and social distancing like they should be, the risk should be pretty minimal. They're in their house. They shouldn't be going out. They're not going to be working from Starbucks and have the risk of getting up with their laptop on the table when they go use the restroom. So, if you're taking a device home or you're leveraging your personal device, I guess I would say what's the risk of a break-in or a robbery in your home would be about the risk of drive theft at that point, unless you're talking about just the employee stealing the drive, in which case, that's sort of a separate issue of an insider threat, where what would be their motivation, and if that is their motivation to steal from the company, they're going to find a way to do that, whether we're working from home or we're in the office in a pre-post COVID-19 world anyway.
Yeah, and to add on to that, at the end of the day, they have the password to decrypt. So even if the drive was encrypted, they could still decrypt it because they have to get onto the laptop to do their work. So the real threat that drive encryption mitigates is for lack of a better term, the evil maid attack. Someone coming in, swapping out the drive or cloning the drive and putting it back into the device. And so, yeah, I agree with everything JD said. Andre, do you have anything to add?
No, I think exactly, yeah. So we need to keep in mind, as you mentioned, Mark, is that drive encryption works when laptop is shut down. So it's pretty much for physical. So if somebody steals a laptop and that laptop is not logged in, then access to the data may be impossible or difficult. And at the same time, if you guys followed the news, you will see that pretty recently there was discovered a flaw in the encryption mechanism, in the keys that OEMs use to encrypt those self-encrypting drives. So even the drives that you may think that were encrypted can be easily decrypted just because of the way the keys for encryption were handled. So that's why they say that just for the future, if you don't have it right now, use BitLocker, don't use OEM's encryption mechanism for self-encryption of those hard drives.
And this goes back to defense in depth. It's great to mitigate these threats, but make sure that we have other things in place to prevent, to prevent exploitation in the event that another control fails. So, all right. So our next question is, based on cybersecurity news, phishing is only one example of attacks leveraging the crisis. What should we do if we hear that a vendor has a cyber incident or we suspect that they have? And then we have a follow-up question to the previous one.
So yes, phishing is only one example of an attack that's leveraging the crisis. You know, the situation opens us up to a lot of other security risks with regard to, are we making sure that we're keeping our patching schedule tight when our IT staff is not in the office? When vulnerabilities are released for critical infrastructure, be that your firewall or your net scalers or anything else that potentially can be accessed from the outside, is that patch schedule being adhered to? Are we responding to those vulnerabilities as they're released the same as we would when we were in the office? Do we have the capacity to update that infrastructure remotely? Does someone need to go into the office to apply those patches and those updates? That's a whole nother vector that absolutely exists, regardless of this sort of situation, but this situation exacerbates it and really puts stress on our ability to mitigate those risks in a timely manner that we may have built out, a very tight schedule for applying patches and monitoring things of that sort when everyone's in the office and we're doing business as usual. But I don't think anyone, very likely, definitely not very many, have built out a plan to carry on that sort of operation, in this sort of scenario. So that's something to consider. And then with regard to what do we do if we hear that a vendor has had a cyber incident, or we suspect that they've had a cyber incident, and that would be, with regard to this, I would say your actions are going to be pretty similar now versus before or after this situation has transpired. And that's going to be, I would potentially engage an IR firm, see where your risk is with regard to that vendor's potential incident, where your overlapping systems are, where you have opened yourself up to risk with interconnection of systems between the vendor and yourself, whether that is sharing of a file share, or you have a VPN set up to that customer, and what systems are being accessed. Engaging an IR firm to do some light forensics on where those at-risk systems would be, to determine if any outside of the normal activity in terms of your vendor accessing those systems, or new IPs connecting to those systems outside of the vendor's typical range and network, etc. That would be my recommendation, and I think that would be a similar reaction, remediation tactic if you had a vendor that was compromised or was suffering through an incident, or potentially suffering through an incident. I would recommend the same thing. Unless you have in-house forensic people, engage an IR firm, determine what systems are at risk, and then have the IR firm focus their forensic analysis on those at-risk systems to determine if there's any outside of normal activity or files accessed or anything along those lines with your at-risk systems. And if there's not, then potentially, unless it's a business critical relationship with that vendor, you think about limiting access from that vendor, forcing password resets, etc., depending upon how that vendor is connecting, to further mitigate any future, risk on your side if that vendor is, depending upon where they are in their remediation and investigation of the incident they may or may not be suffering from.
And one other thing to keep in mind is resist temptation to take on illegal work. Being IT guys, we are good at the technical stuff. Keep in mind that any actions that would result in communication that can be used in court should be authorized by your either inside or external legal counsel. So don't try to reach out to vendors and make any statements, whether it's in case of your own breach or in case of their breach. Don't disclose any details of the situation to an outside audience, to outside companies if something happened in your environment without legal advice. One of the benefits of using external counsel is that there is a way to use attorney-client privilege. So typically, if something like this happens, whether it was before or whether it's now, one of the things to keep in mind is that pretty much all communication related to an incident like this, whether it's internal or external, should be accompanied by a disclaimer that this is privileged and confidential by the request of the general counsel or by request by external counsel. So again, don't try to do legal work, address technical issues, leave interaction with the other entities, and seek advice on how to do that from your legal counsels.
Thanks, Andre. I'm gonna go through a couple of these really quick so we can get down to, we make sure we answer everyone's questions by the top of the hour. The next question we have is, many of us are working at home with kids in the house. Do you have any advice on how we can set ourselves up to secure both our home IT and business tech together? If you have something like Unify or some prosumer style switching and routing, VLANing, of course, is probably going to be your best bet. If you don't, putting home IT onto the guest network and then setting a password up for that, that actually basically does some VLANing, fancy VLANing internally on the consumer routers that can allow you to isolate the home IT from the business tech, or vice versa, putting the business tech on a guest network, so to speak, but with a password, and then allowing everyone else to use the standard, home infrastructure is probably the best way you can do that with consumer models, unless JD or Andre, of
No, that's
kind of any.
That's exactly what I would have suggested. With it really depends upon what your setup is at home and what the aptitude is of the individuals at home. Is setting up VLANs, do you have routing and switching gear that's capable of setting up VLANs? If you do, you probably already have those VLANs set up. If you don't, if you're working with, a modem router combo from your ISP, then Mark's suggestion with leveraging the guest Wi-Fi versus the Wi-Fi you've already had in place is a very good way to sort of separate those your work traffic from your home traffic, and that's probably all you're really going to be capable of doing with regard to residential gear.
But make sure you're using a password.
Yeah, I would add a couple things on a less technical level. I would say, first of all, talk to your kids that this is the job that you need to do. That machine that you are using to connect to work is not the machine for the casual browsing. And if you are not, if you don't have a policy that enforces machine lockout, do it yourself. So whenever you leave your machine unattended, lock that machine so that there is no temptation to start playing games on that machine or to do casual browsing. So even little things like that can definitely help.
Thanks. All right, the next one we have, I'm going to skip ahead one and then come back to the other one in line because it kind of dovetails off of our previous conversation. Let's assume the worst and an endpoint is compromised in a work from home environment. You can shut off the endpoint, but how do you do forensics if lateral movement can't be confirmed?
So I actually would recommend not shutting off the endpoint. I would cut it off from network access, and then we would go through the same mechanisms and process that we follow when remotely collecting any digital evidence. So you would engage a forensic team, but be that an IR firm or someone internally, and they would walk that user through the steps on how to take a forensic image of that device, the hard drive and potentially the memory, as long as they didn't, power down the machine. And then that same individual is going to instruct you on how to transfer that digital file to them, whether that is through a file share or through some other means. And then you're going to forensicate that digital image the same way that you would in any other remote collection scenario. Very often forensics, and as we do IR here internally at Red Leg, if there's any possibility for us to collect that digital evidence from a client remotely, we go that route versus going on site. So that those mechanisms are still in place as long as there is a connection to the internet. So that's what I would say is it's going to be really similar to how we would do that if it's in the office. The most important thing at that point would be to make sure you isolate network communication from that infected machine back to the enterprise environment.
If you shut it down, you end up losing the artifacts that are in memory.
Correct.
Great. Security operations is trying to figure out how to baseline shifts in traffic patterns based on work from home. What should they be looking for?
Firewall logs, seeing how, you know, the change in the amount of data that's passing through your firewall. Your firewall's your perimeter, your egress ingress point. So likely, unless you already had a well architected and developed work from home architecture, you're going to see a significant reduction in the amount of traffic that's passing through your perimeter firewalls.
And specifically with patterns to be looking for, you know, it's hard to say. And it's kind of similar to why it's difficult to look for patterns, malicious patterns of internal to internal traffic. At that point, you're looking for some sort of user behavior and entity analytics, user and entity behavioral analytics. So you have UBA, you have UEBA. In this case, it would be entity behavioral analytics. So, you know, have they contacted this host before? Is this, you know, has this been going out to China and that kind of thing? So if you look at it from the perspective of identifying malicious internal to internal traffic, that, and however you implement that individually, because that's kind of, you know, specific to each implementation, that would be how I would go about that. All right. And kind of a similar question, last mile internet issues and or cloud platform.
Hold on, Mark. Just actually, a panel or an attendee had a good contribution to that question we were just answering. There are applications that you can put in place, SolarWinds, Stealth Watch, etc., that will help you baseline your traffic profile. You're going to see a shift. If you have VPN set up, there should, you know, internal resource access should change, but the volume should not drastically increase or decrease. If it does, in terms of internal resource access, then that would be something to look at. You're going to see very likely traffic reduction traversing the firewall because people are going to be routing traffic out of their homes. But if they're accessing resources internally, your profile shouldn't change terribly unless you've, you know, laid off individuals or certain aspects of your enterprise assets are not going to be accessible in the VPN work from home scenario. Go ahead.
All right. If anyone else has any other open questions, feel free to send those our way. I kind of, you know, we're coming up on the top of the hour here in 10 minutes or so. That the number 2 question that we have, you know, kind of what we wanted to capstone this with is, you know, what should be the focus? What are the quick wins we can do right now as an IT security team? And at the end of the day, you know, our jobs haven't really changed. You know, we're still here mitigating risk. We're still here trying to prevent malicious actors from exploiting our environment. The major risks come in with the end user. So focusing on user engagement, encouraging the users to report phishing emails, and in general, encouraging them to be vigilant and follow best practice that we have been instilling in them due to our security awareness training. You know, I think those in general at a very high level are going to provide the quickest wins and should be best practice in general.
You know, some other quick wins would be, as we've reiterated several times, you know, enabling 2-factor authentication if you haven't already. That's not going to cost you anything extra. It's going to be a little bit of legwork. People are going to complain about it, but if the platforms you're using, if it's available, you should be able to do it without without fundamentally changing your architecture. The more it's 2020, so a lot of people, a lot of institutions already have some people who are working from home occasionally. So, making sure we have those endpoints, the endpoint agents, that are part of enterprise devices installed on whether they be personal devices or enterprise devices that people are taking home, your AV tools, your EDR tools, if you have them. Trying to maintain centralized logging if that's possible, because that's your security team, that's your IT team's insight into what's happening, what traffic your hosts are passing to and from the internet, to and from the cloud, to and from your other devices within the infrastructure. So those are the same things that I'm going to suggest an enterprise do, whether people are working from home or not. Log aggregation, centralized logging, endpoint agents, making sure things stay up to date, VPN, two-factor authentication.
I would.
Sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
No, I would suggest also, again, this is not the time to run penetration tests, right, and to do phishing campaigns. But if you can reach out to your community just to reinforce whatever way, whether do a quick 30-minute webinar, whether do an email reminding people about safe security practices, that would be good. Just because, again, everyone is stressed, people may forget what they were told, what they were taught. I think a step like this, reminding them how to keep cybersecurity hygiene together with washing hands for 20 seconds, right, would be helpful. And another thing I would suggest also is that, God forbid, but if you have a breach in a situation like this, you may be facing delays with having that breach handled. If there is any way, and if you don't have a retainer in place with the incident response company, it may be a good time to think about it and to put a retainer in place, because you don't want to start looking for help when you are already behind the schedule, right? So if you are able to establish a relationship with an incident response company and have a retainer in place, that will help you greatly. Again, hopefully you won't need to do that, but in case you will.
Thanks, Andre. And then there's a follow-up to the original statement. Quick wins are good, but how do we stay on our roadmap to mature our program in this extraordinary operating environment? I think at this point, the cat's out of the bag, right? To use a turn of phrase, more people are going to be working from home after this, and everyone's been saying, this is the new normal. So I don't think too much has changed, but the fact that we are now, as a industry, going to have a larger remote workforce is something we need to take into account. And so as we move forward, we say, okay, the way that we are handling endpoints isn't going to change necessarily. The way that we're handling server security, the way that we're handling monitoring, at its core isn't going to change. The specific implementations may change. So we may want to move to a cloud-based SIEM to pull logs from a remote workforce if we're not going to do an always-on VPN, things like that. But at the core, the frameworks aren't going to change, and in my opinion, the risks aren't going to change as much. I would say that the biggest changes we are going to see are going to be on the engineering side of things, the specific implementations of these solutions. So to answer your question, I would say that engineering solutions and engineering your tools to accommodate a large remote workforce, regardless of how large you anticipate it will be down the line, is probably going to be the best way to stay on that roadmap. So that way you can accommodate in the event that something like this happens again, or in the event that this situation that we are in currently lasts for longer than 6 to 8 months.
I fully agree with what Mark just said, so I don't really have much to add to it.
Andre, want to add on?
Yeah, and I would say address your security in a systematic way. And don't, when you are thinking about security, like, don't start with let's improve security. Think about what you're trying to protect, because in so many conversations that we have with our clients, the starting point is usually let's have a better security. It's not where you start. You need to start what specifically you're trying to protect. When we know, and when you know what specifically we are trying to protect, because no one has unlimited security budget, we can get a greater benefit of a dollar or an effort hour implemented to or spend to protect your environment.
Great. And we had one more comment. That's if you don't have two-factor, you definitely need to be monitoring for failed login spraying and for credential spraying. And that's something, yes, even if you do have two-factor, monitor for that. Specifically, a technique that sprays usernames across a single password. So in other words, it's pretty trivial to identify an email address format and an internal username format, and then to use LinkedIn or other marketing websites that give names away for free, and then that force you to pay for their contact info. We can extrapolate that information and create a massive list of users, and then attempt to spray passwords like, currently a good one would be Spring 2020 or Spring 20 with a capital S. And then that meets both the AD default password complexity requirements, which is 3 of the 4 upper lower number special. And if you have a 90-day change policy, what I saw from my time as a red teamer was a lot of individuals using the seasons, since they change every 90 days roughly, as their password plus the year. Or company name 1 is another good one to look for. But in general, monitoring for credential spraying, specifically lots of users across a single password, is definitely something to keep an eye out for.
Very likely, if you're doing some sort of centralized log aggregation or you have a SIM in place, you already have rules built into those systems that are going to be looking for this sort of activity.
There is one log source that isn't as readily ingested, and that is going to be OWA. If somebody is replaying the actual login HTTP post, that's not going to show up in the same log source as if somebody were using, trying to log in directly to a domain controller. And it's one of the ways that we were able to evade logging previously. I never implemented those logs, so I can't provide remediation, but looking at OWA logging, I think, is pretty important.
And that's why I would lean on the, not only the logging, but OWA, O365 are pretty straightforward, easy systems to implement two-factor authentication on. So if you haven't, do that first.
Yep. And it should be free for O365.
Yep.
All right, guys. Well, that brings us to the top of the hour. I want to thank you all for the great questions. Every single one of them was fantastic. And thank you for, taking the time out of your day to come in here. And, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out and we will be more than happy to give you the answer to the best of our abilities.
And please stay safe.
Yes. And wash your hands.